Hello and welcome to week 7. Um, this week we're covering racial justice and health. Um, and I hope all of you are doing well. And if you are in Toronto, enjoying the first snowfall. So as always, we'll start with a land acknowledgement. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have longstanding relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So as I've said before, I live right next to York, just around the corner, and this is what the land looked like this morning. So my two kids, we were thrilled, and I could not get them out the door fast enough. They both went out and played in the snow for a little while this morning. So this is today on Toronto Purchase, snowing. So just two notes to start. The first one is, you may have noticed that I used to have closed captioning. For some reason, the closed captioning has stopped. I don't know why. I've talked to IT about it and they didn't even know how I had closed captioning from the beginning. So I'm very sorry about that. We've been bringing it up, and York is supposed to be buying some third-party software that's going to allow us to be able to have closed captioning through Zoom. That's an access issue. What I'll do from now on is I will record the lecture and post it to YouTube, so you could see the closed captioning on YouTube. So that will be the workaround moving forward. So to start today, I want to say that we are all, of course, coming to this topic, thinking about racism and racial justice from different social locations, right? For some of and health, because you know it, you live it. For some of you, it's going to be something that you're just learning about, that you're surprised by, that you're outraged by, that you're mad about, that you want to learn more about. So I want each of us to think about where we're coming from and whether this is something we can engage in with right now. So we are living during COVID. We are living during, other social pandemics of racism, of ableism, of inequity, and we're all living it in different ways. So if this week, this is not something you can think about because of your own lived experience, that's fine. Give that to yourself. It's okay. You can take a week off. You can engage with pieces of this lecture when you feel able to. And if you don't feel able to at all, that's okay too. Go and take a nap. I give you permission. Spend the time you were going to listen to this lecture by taking a nap. If you are interested, all throughout the presentation, most things are hyperlinked. So if you want to learn more, and you're interested in thinking about this more, racism and the ways it's showing up in healthcare are new to you, please engage with all the content throughout this lecture. Email me if you want more content in specific areas, if you want to do more reading, if you want to listen to some webinars. I've got lots of sort of good stuff on anti-racism work and ways that you can engage in that. So if you are sort of feeling maybe that this topic, you don't have enough understanding behind it in order to really get into things, again, email me and I can send you some stuff you can read to really understand some of maybe your reactions to this kind of learning. Yeah, so that's just my invitation to you, is that there's different ways that you can interact with this, and that's kind of moving forward, right? Next week, we'll be taking up disability justice, food justice, Indigenous ontologies. So in any of those weeks, if you're really feeling like it's too heavy this week to engage with that kind of content because of your own lived experience. And I give you that permission to just walk away. I explained that a couple of weeks ago as we moved into this module 3, that you're really going to work towards writing your own paper in one of these kind of broad areas, taking up health inequity from an intersectional framework. And so, if you're thinking, really, I want to focus on disability, or really want to focus on, the intersection of food and race, then focus more deeply on that week, and sort of give yourself permission to take a week off when you need to, or do less readings, or engage with less pieces of the lecture. So a recap, last week we took up COVID and specifically looked at Toronto, and actually specifically this area of York University Heights, to look at the ways that COVID has showed up differently, based on different intersections, right? Around class, around race, around sort of immigration status, all those kinds of things. So we took that up in depth. We looked at some data by the neighborhood. So you might have gone in and looked at what your neighborhood looks like, which might have been surprising to you, might not have been surprising to you. We know that this northwest corner is one of the hardest hit, has never really felt a reprieve. The whole entire time has just been living really the brunt of this pandemic. We looked at all the different ways that shows up, why this neighborhood is being impacted in those ways, and that those have long histories. So really looking at the social determinants of health and COVID, and ways that the social determinants allow you either to shield yourself from COVID or put yourself in much more positions of risk because you cannot shield yourself. And that we talked about that as being failures of policy, as being failures of government, as being failures of society, to have built such a society of inequity that COVID is being lived in very inequitable ways. COVID has really shone the light on inequity. For those who were not living it and didn't have to think about it, are now sort of being forced to, through all of the data that's coming out that's showing us where COVID is being lived. So we also took up the article on the approaches to health equity. So we took up the universal approach, targeted, and targeted universal. And we started doing a bit of that, and we'll continue to do that throughout the weeks, because that is going to be an essential piece of your major writing assignment. So you're going to take one of these approaches to actually propose an intervention. What could that look like into a health equity issue? So basically, the ways that I'm thinking about these next weeks on racial justice, disability justice, food justice, and Indigenous ontologies is to really imagine sort of the kind of thinking that you'll do in your major assignment. So I'll be pulling out kind of grassroots interventions from folks in communities responding to inequity in health, ways that inequity is how that's taking place, and then what kind of approaches our community asking for. And you can kind of think about those in terms of universal, targeted, or targeted universal. So these weeks are really essential in kind of forming your ideas and your thinking around doing that major assignment. Today, so I talked about this at the beginning of the course, and the way that we are really approaching and framing the way we're learning is that we're going to be learning about racism and health, and not about race and health. And we'll unpack that more as we move through, but that's really the overall frame that we're approaching this with. So what's different when we approach it with this frame? What's different when we understand the problem to be racism and not the problem to be race? What is different when we understand problems in this way? Where do we then look for intervention? At which level, right? So we talked a lot about from the beginning, moving from individual intervention to structural intervention. And so when we think about, one of the social determinants of health being racism, we think about where our intervention needs to be, and it's on a very different level. So today I'll just briefly take up the readings, and I'm really going to be sort of extending them further. So, you've done the reading, you've been thinking about what this looks like, and then we'll keep moving that understanding forward. So really just kind of big overview picture of how racism is showing up in health on many different levels. So we'll take up interventions from the community. And as I said, it's kind of a way to start modeling your major assignment. So there'll be two pieces. Today I'll do a lecture, and then we'll have a guest lecture by Andrea Vasquez Jimenez, who is a community organizer. She just ran for the NDP party in this area. We just had a federal by-election, so she ran as their candidate. She is the co-director of a really amazing grassroots organization. So you'll get to know her and her work in organizing police-free schools. So what does that look like in terms of impacts on health, especially for racialized students? So we'll have two lectures today. We'll have this one, and then you're gonna get the opportunity to have the guest lecture from Andrea Vasquez Jimenez, which is was recorded, so you can watch when that works for you. So I just wanted to start very briefly, again, overview the kind of the four dimensions of racism. So when we're thinking about racism, what are we thinking about? So this is a really great graphic that kind of shows us where racism shows up. So one is institutional, the policies and practices that reinforce racist standards within a workplace or an organization. So that's the institutional level, right? And that's happening in all of our institutions. We're focusing on health, but when we think about social determinants, we think about education, we think about early childhood, we think about policing, food, all of those spaces. Racism is embedded in all of those institutions in very different ways. Structural, multiple institutions collectively uphold racist policies, which is essentially society, right? So that bigger structural level that we're always talking about is basically made up of multiple institutions that are working under a logic, and that logic is white supremacy, which enacts racism. Then there's interpersonal, so racist acts and microaggressions carried out from one person to another. So we've talked a bit about that kind of thing, right? That these human rights abuses happen on individual levels. Someone, you talked a lot about that in your critical reflection papers. Someone goes to see a doctor, and that's where racism takes place, in that space between patient and doctor. So that interpersonal, because of course the structural is reflected in institutional and reflected in the interpersonal, and vice versa. And the last piece, which we've talked about a bit from your critical reflection papers, is the internalized dimension. So these subtle and overt messages that basically reinforce those negative beliefs in your own self, right? So that create self-hatred in your own self. Internalization that says you are not worthy, right? That you don't belong in a certain space. So we internalize that because it's happening on all of these levels. These messages are so strong. They're so all encompassing. They're showing up in all different spaces. We internalize them. And so some of you talked about actively working against that in your critical reflection papers, which is just so powerful to read, because these are massive, massive structures and systems that produce and reproduce social practices in our lives. And it's a lot of work to work against internalization of that. So those of you on that path, it's beautiful, powerful, and just so, so difficult. So be gentle with yourself as you're thinking about those things. It's just an ongoing process. We never finish that process of kind of rejecting that internalization. It's a long, long process, and we need support doing it. So I want to think about today some kind of sort of examples of the way racism shows up in the space of health. So there's a video here. I won't play it, but I invite you to play it. She's a researcher at UC Davis talking about two pieces. One is about microaggressions, and many of you took up this idea of microaggressions in the ways you experienced racism in healthcare. And so I put a link there. You can see in the top, there's a great Instagram post on what microaggressions are. So the name microaggression might sort of make us think that they're small things. That's not what microaggression means. Microaggression means it happening on that micro level. So it's happening between individuals, but the impact of microaggressions, especially cumulative microaggressions, is very, very damaging, right? That is the cumulative effect of racism. So there's the larger, the structural, the institutional, the internalized, and then these microaggressions that are happening constantly in interactions with people are very weighty and very much add up. So, an example of sort of a reaction to microaggressions is a couple of students mentioned in their papers that in their critical reflection papers, that they would, dress a certain way to go to see the doctor. So they would dress up and sort of show, physical signs on their bodies that they are, sort of, worthy or, you know, uh, educated or all those kinds of things. And that's response to microaggressions, right? Many of us don't think about what we're wearing when we go to the doctor, because I know that's not going to influence the way I will be treated or cared for or not cared for. But many of you have to think about that daily. So microaggressions are intense because they're always happening. There's research on how many microaggressions, for example, in an educational space students of color receive in a certain spatial amount of time. So say, in 90 days. And if you think about what that does to you, it's very damaging. So anyways, you can think about, you can watch that video. She talks about microaggressions. And then she also talks about something that we need to think about, which is content and curriculum in training healthcare workers. And so the ways that healthcare workers are being trained does something to the ways that they're actually going to care for people. So she talks about that in this small, I think it's 2 minutes or something, the video. So if you want, check that out, because we do need to think about that, who you're reading, what studies you're taking up, how it's reinforcing, racist ideas around how to care for people. So I'd urge you to look at that. I put the link there, and then you can just watch the video. So again, we had some few readings for today. The first one was that report from the Wellesley Institute on color-coded healthcare. And so let me move this over. So I pulled this out from the reading, so you can go back and look at that. Epidemiologist Nancy Krieger has suggested 6 pathways through which racism harms health. So they lay them out, right? Economic and social deprivations, toxic substances and hazardous conditions, targeting marketing of harmful commodities. If we go through these, you could map those onto the social determinants, right? So the economic piece, toxic substances and hazardous conditions. What comes to mind for me here is, mold and asbestos in housing and First Nations communities. That immediately sort of was what comes to mind for me. So if we think about those links between racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and links to harming of health. So it's a interesting way to think about these pathways and how we can map those onto the social determinants of health. The report ends, and you can go through the report. It's a great sort of synopsis of lots of different research that's happened to really get a good understanding of the way racism shows up in health. Some questions we need to ask. The report's telling us what kind of monitoring system might accurately and effectively reveal the causes of health inequities, given the unique nature of Canada's healthcare system. So we mentioned before, COVID has now got public health to start collecting race-based data. What kind of monitoring system do we need to put into place? What would intersectionality say we need to do? Who would need to be doing that monitoring? There's a project, it's housed at York University, called Disability Rights Promotion International, and they do monitoring of human rights abuses in the disability field. And the whole methodology of the monitoring is that people with disabilities are monitoring their own rights. So it's not about people who do not experience ableism, who do not experience violations of their rights because of their disability doing the monitoring. It's people with disabilities themselves. So intersectionality tells us that that is the path forward. How can we best incorporate the voices of both healthcare providers and racialized healthcare consumers in an analysis of the causes of health inequities? So with that question, we see some, sort of assumptions or reflections in there, which is that healthcare providers are not racialized because we're saying we need both of them. And that's something that by far was in the critical reflection papers I read, was by far the #1 intervention that people put forward, which was racialized folks need to be in positions of power in terms of healthcare provision. That is what is actually going to move the dial on racism. What kinds of interventions are likely to have an impact not only on the level of population health, but also individual experiences of health and illness? So these can help guide your thinking when you're writing your major assignment. So these interventions, where do they need to happen, right? So on the population health, right? So if you think about universal, but then we also have to have some targeted in there, right? Because individual experiences, and we talked a lot about this in terms of COVID last week, are showing up in very specific areas, racialized populations experiencing, overcrowded housing and poverty. So how do we do targeted approaches well? What does intersectionality tell us as a framework that can help guide these interventions? So it's kind of just I just wanted to say a few words on the readings. That was the one kind of major reading to do. And then the next ones were the readings specifically around COVID. So thinking about racism and COVID. So this report came out, Impact of COVID-19, the Black Canadian Perspective. So it was just released September 2nd. And no surprise, we've started to talk about this already last week. Compared to the Canadian average, Black Canadians report far worse health outcomes related to COVID-19. They're nearly 3 times as likely, 21 to 8%, to report knowing someone who has died due to the virus. So some of you are saying, yes, this is my story. If I'm reading this report, I went through it. This is speaking about my community. Many of us, are all going to have, as I keep saying, different experiences. We're not all in this together in terms of COVID. And we see that from the fact that Black Canadians are 3 times more likely to report knowing someone who has died due to the virus. So, an important piece, and we talked about this last week, although further research is needed, poor health outcomes for Black Canadians may be explained by greater exposure at work to the virus. So we talked about that last week when we looked at sort of job precarity, what that looks like in this area, and went further to think about transit as a way of, overcrowded transit in terms of transmission for people getting to work, getting to multiple jobs, so multiple times on transit in one day versus working from home or driving to a small space where you aren't around many people. Black Canadians report much worse financial impact from COVID-19 than the average Canadian. So layoffs, worrying about paying their rent. So those are all ways that we are seeing COVID sort of intensifying this equity, intensifying racism in health. And you can go through the whole report. It's quite long, but there's lots of sort of infographics and ways that they've showed the data that are interesting. And it might be a piece that you want to take one piece of that and write your major assignment on it. So you could go through it and pull something out, right? So here we see at the bottom, when it comes to age and gender, it's Black men over 45 years who are most negatively impacted by COVID when it comes to household finances. Why? What's happening there? What is that about gender and age that are intersecting? What's happening there? Is it what's happening in terms of employment there? That might be something you want to look at, right? And think about what's happening there, and then what is an intervention that could work at this inequitable situation. So this idea we started out with, that we're focusing on racism and not on race. So I've linked this quote that I pulled out of an article. It's going to show up throughout the lecture. So it's an interview with one of the founders of Doctors for Defunding the Police, which mobilized around the start of COVID here in Toronto. And it really pushes this idea that we need to move the conversation somewhere else. We can't have the same old conversations that we had. And this is exactly what we're doing. We're pushing this conversation somewhere different. So when we do that, as we started at the beginning of the course in module 1 to think about, is that we then propose interventions in different spaces. So we don't propose individual interventions that are happening on specific bodies. We are intervening on where the inequity is, which is created in society through policy, through different spaces in healthcare, in education. So not at the individual level, but at that societal or systemic level. So again, the question in this interview was in response to stats showing that racialized people in Toronto make up 83% of COVID cases. Some have called race a risk factor for COVID. But as you and other founders of Doctors for Defunding Police pointed out, quote, race does not determine health outcomes, racism does. So then he elaborates on that. And that's exactly what we're trying to do too, right? Is to push the conversation onto racism, onto intervening in racism and thinking about racial justice. Okay, so I saw this from Teach Me Public Health. They did this great post. There's 2 slides up here, and let me move this over. The sugar-coated language of racism in medicine. So there's some real tangible ways that racism shows up in healthcare. So some of these might stick out to you. Some of these, if you're a healthcare provider, maybe you've done them. Maybe you've heard colleagues say these kinds of things. And it's a way for us to understand kind of how racism operates in this space. So let's go through them. Do some of them speak to you? Have you lived them? Are some of them surprising? If we think about mapping ourselves on the wheel of power, we can kind of understand where we sit in terms of whether they're surprising or whether we experience them or somewhere in between. So the first one, social determinants of health, says, so when we say that, Teach Me Public Health is kind of pushing us to think about that in a bit more of a critical way. And it says it implies that people do not actively invest in systems that cause health disparities. Who or what is determining poor health outcomes? So again, putting it back up and saying, okay, what's happening here in this space that is determining these poor health outcomes? These are decisions being made or not being made, action taken or action not taken, which creates these situations of inequity. And when we say BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, and people of color are at higher risk for when we say that, the problem is that we are centering race as the risk factor. Or is it racism? The medical field needs to call out racism for what it is, instead of implying that health risks are independent from systems of oppression. And that's the kind of learning we are doing throughout this course. You started it with Timothy's article, and we're going to keep working through that. This idea around diversity and inclusion training. I mean, that word diversity, I just don't like diverse from what? It's still centering whiteness. Whiteness is always centered, and then you're diverse from whiteness. So again, when we say these things, and you may be saying them meaning well, right? We need a more diverse workforce. We need more diverse doctors, but it's still centering whiteness. And when we still center whiteness, we're not moving towards a different way of operating, a different way of viewing the world. Implicit or unconscious bias, we're going to go take that up further later. Calling patients drug seekers. We've seen this through, I think we've talked about it a little bit, or maybe folks talked about in their critical reflection papers in terms of Indigenous folks and anti-Indigenous racism. This is really the way it shows up. And many Indigenous folks have died in healthcare settings because of this horrific racist viewpoint. So yeah, if we're being asked to, then we have this column here on your left-hand side of the screen, and then we can shift it, right? So social determinants of health, meaning health outcomes due to systemic forms of racism and oppression. Center that. That's what we want to center, right? Instead of saying BIPOC are a higher risk for, we say racism increases the risk for. Diversity inclusion, actually what we're talking about is discrimination, systemic racism awareness training, or anti-racism awareness training, or anti-oppression training, which we'll talk about later. Implicit or unconscious bias, let's call it racism, right? We're going to take that up after. Calling patients drug seekers, having a racial empathy gap, and failing, that's what's happening here, and failing to acknowledge and treat the pain of Black patients. So I think I've mentioned it before, there's lots of research that shows this idea that white doctors will not prescribe pain medications to Black patients the way they do to white patients. So they don't believe the pain of Black patients, whereas they do believe pain of white patients. And that, you know, lots of folks have pointed out that that has long sort of history and racism, and around how certain bodies in slavery, and how certain bodies can withstand pain in different ways, which is completely bogus, but something that has a long sort of discourse, which is rooted in slavery. So these are kind of ways that racism shows up, and then ways that we can talk about it differently, talk about it as racism, name it as racism, because then we will intervene in different ways. If we're not having the right conversations, we are unable to make change. Okay, so I said we're going to take up implicit bias or unconscious bias. They kind of are the same things. You sometimes see it called implicit bias, and sometimes you hear it called unconscious bias. So obviously we know racism isn't new, and there's been, you know, programs, policies, ideas on how we can work against racism for a long time now. In the 1980s, we saw kind of the introduction of affirmative action programs. So ways that a workplace can say, okay, if the population breakdown by race is this, for example, in Canada, then that should be reflected in our organization, right? So we do that here at York. We have an affirmative action program in terms of faculty on who is hired. So it should, you know, in terms of gender, race, disability, and indigeneity, to try to bring the number of those categories up in the space of York University. So now there's kind of been a shift to talk more about implicit or unconscious bias training. So yes, you know, we still have affirmative action programs, you know, federal government has it, you know, all different spaces do affirmative action, but then kind of pushing that further is to ask people to think about how implicit or unconscious bias informs the way that they think about race. So some of you may have heard of these terms, some of you haven't. So first, as I said, we'll go through them, and then we're going to think about them critically, like they asked us to do in that last slide. So I want you to think about these two ideas and how they play out in healthcare. So we're going to take up, now we're going to think about implicit bias and unconscious or unconscious bias, and then later on, we're going to think about anti-oppression training. So the idea I want us to think about is that this is ongoing work. It's not that we kind of think about this once and then move forward. We're constantly having to think about what our own implicit biases are and how those play out. And thinking about engaging in anti-racism work all the time as an ongoing process, as something that we don't just accomplish, but something we're consistently working at. So not just one training and we're done, but ongoing reflection and work. So I'm just going to play this quick video, implicit bias, peanut butter, jelly, and racism.
Bias. Bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm gonna say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there is an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem. One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's a scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
Okay, so this idea around implicit bias, right, is that because of all those things, which she kind of calls a big fog around us, inform the ways that we understand what's happening in the world. Sorry, I just had to pause it. I was trying to get to another video, but I can't get to it right now off of the presentation. So basically, this idea that we have, these implicit biases, and that's the reason why we act in these ways. If you go on to their website, you can see there's another video about kind of telling us how we can work against our own implicit biases, if you want to look at that. Then there's a third one talking about interesting research that takes up conditions that they say impact implicit bias. Also, Harvard has this huge study that they're doing around thinking about implicit biases. Down at the bottom, I put the link there, and you can actually test to see your own implicit biases. So there's all different areas you can go into, and you can kind of do this empirical test on your own self to see where your biases lie. So this idea that we hold all of these ideas, and that's the reason that we are reacting to certain people in certain ways. And so the idea around implicit bias is that if we recognize these biases in ourselves, we can then correct them. So when we, an idea pops into our mind, when we see someone, we can say, okay, wait, what's at play here? So that's the kind of ways that we intervene in our own implicit biases. So before we start to kind of critically take up the idea of implicit biases, I want us to think about and look at some data on race. So there's this, I follow this account, The Conscious Kid, on Instagram, and they did this really great post. I'm going to pull it up. Are your kids too young to talk about race? Nope. Silence about race can reinforce racism by letting children draw their own conclusions. So I just want to pull it up because it is, and then it's not coming up. Sorry, so many technical difficulties today. Okay, so I just want to go through them because I think some of them might be surprising to some. At birth, babies look equally at faces of all races. And at 3 months, babies look more at faces that match the race of their caregivers. So we're already seeing in under a year old, right, where babies are looking at. Children as young as 2 use race to reason about people's behavior. 2 years old, that's tiny. By 30 months, most children use race to choose playmates. So that they're not even 3 years old yet, and they're already making those kinds of choices. 4 to 5 years, expression of racial prejudice often peak at ages 4 and 5. And many of you are saying, yeah, I've had this experience as young as 4 to 5. Racism, that's how young kids are already enacting these kinds of racial prejudices. 5 years, Black and Latinx children in research settings show no preference towards their own groups as compared to white children at this age, who are more likely to be strongly biased in favor of whiteness. So think about that. Like, what's happening here? We've done research in this area. We know, right? So when whiteness is consistently centered for white children, when, you know, all of that messaging around them, this is what happens. At 5 years old, they're already showing preference to play with other white kids, whereas Black and Latino kids aren't doing that. 5 years old, by kindergarten, children show many of the same racial attitudes held by adults in our culture. They've already learned to associate some groups with higher status than others. My oldest daughter, so I've told you before, I think my kids are Black. My oldest daughter did go to the Afrocentric alternative school, but with COVID right now isn't. We have her enrolled in kind of a nature school that's predominantly white. So she had been in a Black space for all of her education, and now she's in a very white space, and she's in grade 1. And on her first day, someone said that her lunch was disgusting. That's a microaggression. That's a racialized microaggression, right? So by kindergarten, children are already enacting those ideas that their parents hold around whiteness and higher status. So we see these, it's very young. It's not, we're seeing our interventions need to start at a very different level. Explicit conversations with 5 to 7-year-olds about interracial friendship can dramatically improve their racial attitudes in as little as a single week. So I think this idea that sometimes educators will say, like, everyone's the same, we're all special, you know, I don't see race, I don't see color. It's actually the completely wrong intervention, because it's complete cognitive dissonance for kids. Kids see color, we all do, of course, unless you're colorblind. And so this idea that not addressing these conversations is very, very damaging. So we need to intervene on that and say, if this is already happening at this young age, then we need to have these complex conversations age appropriate at this age. So in my daughter's school, in the Afrocentric school, they talk about shadism and colorism in kindergarten, in junior kindergarten. That's what she was learning, right? And she understood it. And she, you know, would sit on a Saturday afternoon drawing and, you know, draw someone and write under, and she'd ask me to write underneath, all Black is beautiful, right? Like that, we can have these conversations in different ways with kids at young age that can actually have interventions. So we're not getting to the point, you know, further along the road, university level. Some of you mentioned that it's criminal that at not until university are we exposed to these kinds of ideas. So I just wanted to pull that up because I thought it was interesting for us just to think about how young this is happening at. This is not, there we go. So this is how young implicit bias starts. So again, returning to healthcare. In the US, there's research on implicit bias as playing a role in healthcare disparities. So the most highly cited early study was back in 1999, involved 720 physicians who were asked to diagnose and recommend treatment based upon videos of actors portraying patients of different races. And they use the same script and the same gestures, right? So to kind of to keep everything similar. Physicians were 40% less likely to refer African Americans for cardiac catheterization than whites, with African American women receiving the lowest referral rates. In another study, researchers analyzed both implicit and explicit racial attitudes of self-identified medical doctors. So they found that levels of bias largely mirrored those of the general population, right? So the doctors are human, with doctors showing a more favorable bias towards white Americans over Black Americans. The greatest bias towards whites was found amongst, anyone surprised? Do you want to guess? White male doctors. Hispanic doctors also showed strong preferences for whites, and Black male doctors showed lower levels of preference for whites. Among women, white female doctors showed lower levels of preference for whites than white male doctors. And the only group, Black female doctors, showed no preference for any racial group. So clearly, Black female doctors are doing their work and treating their patients from a human rights approach, which is, right, the approach that we should all be coming from, which is that everyone has the right to treatment and meeting each patient where they're at. So this idea, we know we have the research now that's showing us what's happening. We don't, have it as much. In Canada, we've brought that up and said that we need to move in that direction. So let's move to unpacking this piece around implicit bias a little bit and thinking about what are we really talking about? Are we talking about implicit bias? Or are we actually talking about racism? In that video, one of the researchers said, having implicit bias isn't the same as being a racist, that calling someone a racist is such a loaded, huge thing right now. So I want us to think about, again, who is being centered. And this piece of intent over impact. Some of you have maybe started to think about this piece on intent over impact. Some of you are just starting to think about it. I put a quote card up here. Your intention does not absolve you from your impact. So we cannot prioritize intent over impact. We actually have to focus on impact because that's where the harm is happening. So when we focus on intent, we're still centering whiteness, right? So we're still saying, it's implicit bias. It's not really your fault. It's, you grew up like that. That's how you think. We're still centering whiteness. When we center those being harmed, so those experiencing the impact of racism, then we're doing something different. So I think implicit bias is still very much centering whiteness, and racism is not. Racism is centering who is experiencing harm. And I think if we want to actually focus on the harm happening in healthcare, we need to center those receiving the harm. So I want you to think about, as we're talking through this, right, as you're thinking about the implicit bias piece, then you're thinking about, okay, well, is implicit bias actually just racism? The impact's the same, right? So we're talking about the harm of racism. It doesn't matter if it's happening because someone intends to do it or not intends to do it. The harm looks the same. So you may be perpetrating a microaggression unknowingly, but the harm still is the same for the person living it. So what do you think about this from your social location? Are you uncomfortable? Does this make a lot of sense? Does this feel like something you're not too sure about and you want to read more about or think more about? Is it making you sort of, shift a little bit or reorient your thinking in certain areas? I want you to think about how your social location informs this thinking. How does it inform your thinking? Why? Do you normally find yourself in the group of having implicit bias, or do you normally find yourself in the group that has received harm? And again, those aren't like binary categories, right? We move between them. Do you not think your social location informs this thinking? Do you just truly think that, that we all need to treat each other the same and we don't need to unpack this in really deep ways? How do you know things? When we think about these kind of deeper, really deep-seated problems of racism, of ableism, sexism, we do really have to think about how we know things. Who's shaped that knowing for us? How has your education thus far shaped what you know? How does the messaging in society, how does who were your teachers and what they looked like, how does that shape your knowing of our world, of your understanding of what's happening? Do you think you could know differently if you had access to other ways of knowing? Right. So I brought up the example of my daughter going to the Afrocentric school. So obviously I'm white, and my partner's Black. And so my daughter's being brought up in, mostly white space. My partner's family doesn't live here, so she's around my family. And so we were very intentional about her going to the Afrocentric school, because she needs to know herself and who she is. And that has to be shaped in a very specific way outside of racism before she meets racism, in explicit ways in education, in other spaces. So I want you to think about that idea of kind of knowing differently if we had access to other ways of knowing. And that's some of the work we're doing throughout this course, is how we can understand health on the front lines in a different way if we ask different people to come into this space and talk about what health on the front lines looks like, how our understanding of it can be shifted and we could know things in different ways. So the second piece that I wanted to think about today was around anti-oppression training, on whether anti-oppression training can be a way that we intervene in this space, intervene in racism, in health, broadly defined. So what could this look like? Anti-oppression training. So anti-oppression training is a specific kind of training. So we have that same image there. So I just pulled this off of the York students website. So this is your student association on campus, and they do anti-oppression training. So they pulled that same image. We talked about it before, and we did one that kind of moves further into liberation. They take this image around equality and equity, and how anti-oppression training can really help us work towards equity and equitable rights and policies. So how it can intervene in different spaces. So what does this look like played out in healthcare? So research shows us that there actually is efficacy in anti-oppression training for healthcare professionals. So this is something people didn't name it as anti-oppression training, but people did talk about this idea that we need to intervene in the ways that healthcare professionals are trained. So results show that anti-oppression curriculum can enhance healthcare professionals' confidence in addressing bias in healthcare through allyship. For those who value social justice and equity, moving from the role of bystander to a place of awareness and solidarity allows for one's behaviors to mirror these values. So if you're interested in seeing the research, I can send it to you. Just send me an email. I could send you a link to this study. But this piece around anti-oppression training, it can be, this kind of training can be done in all kinds of spaces. So I wanted to think about what this could look like in terms of an intervention that would be kind of targeted universalism. So what if when healthcare practitioners were going through their education, anti-oppression training was actually streamlined? Or what about, when they started a new position, say at a hospital or at a clinic? So basically universal anti-oppression training, that has to be part of a healthcare worker's training, that should be integrated in their training. But then going back to the research that I read out before that talked about this idea that certain doctors hold biases in different ways, right? So Black female doctors actually don't even need any anti-oppression training. They're good. They're treating all the patients the same. But white male doctors, Hispanic male doctors, I think white female doctors need some more anti-oppression training. So what if we thought about it in terms of targeted universalism? So everyone's going to do the training, right? But if we think about it in terms of specific interventions into subgroups, where we might see more disparity in terms of equity. So what could that look like in terms of targeted universalism? How could that show up? So thinking about that as an intervention. And so I did think about this a lot as I marked your critical reflection papers in ways that you were asking for something, but maybe weren't naming it as anti-oppression training. So I just wanted to show a couple of examples. This one, you can click on the video. It's not linked to, it's linked to the page that talks about this this program. So it's at McGill University, and they have mandatory anti-oppression training for all of their residents, staff. So anyone who works in their university residences where students live have to do anti-oppression training. So they did some work, they heard from students and were like, this has to be essential. Like this needs to be how our workers are trained. So how would that relate to health equity? So life at university, right, is stressful. Who is the space designed for? How can you thrive as a student? Who thrives as a student? Who is residence designed as a safe space for? What if we thought about different inequities in that space in a really meaningful way through this kind of training? What if we all had access to anti-oppression training as students of a university? What if anti-oppression training was mandatory at the beginning of university, or as healthcare workers, as university professors, as bus drivers? And then again, this piece around targeted. So if we had race-based data that we collected in different areas, we would know which areas need to be targeted, which healthcare professionals need more training, which bus drivers need more training. So again, this seems huge and unwieldy, right? It seems too big to be able to do, but we have data that shows efficacy, that it shows that it actually intervenes in inequity, that people change their behavior and begin to actually work in more equitable ways. And that makes the space more equitable for all. So we do massive trainings, right? In other things, in WMIS and in the AODA, those are big training programs that happen in big institution like healthcare spaces, hospitals. So what could this look like? Could you imagine this kind of program? So that's the kind of sort of thinking I want you to think about when you're doing that major writing assignment. So one day when you are working, or maybe you are now working in the area of health, and you start to identify inequities and injustice that have real health outcomes, negative health outcomes, what do you do? How do you organize? Maybe, you approach your boss or whoever's above you and say, maybe could we do some anti-oppression training? Would that be an option? Would that be something that you'd be open to? Start to shift the conversation to talk about things in different ways, think about different ways that interventions are enacted. Can you picture this? Does it seem possible to you, or does this seem too big? Maybe you've done something like this before, or maybe this is an area that you are thinking about. Maybe this is an area you want to think more about. So I wanted to highlight that kind of example as targeted universalism, and the way it could show up in different spaces. So now I want to think a little bit about ways racial justice in health, broadly defined, is actually being built. What are folks doing on the ground? So here at York Future Black Physicians Initiative, you can check them out. I put their hand up there. That was their Facebook. They organize, right? They've got events. They get together and as young Black people at York wanting to be physicians in the future, how do you support each other? How do you mentor each other? How do you network together? Dear MD to Be is a great, I found them on Twitter, celebrating the diversity in medicine. They're out of U of T, and they're really just talking about, diversity in medicine. And it's, you can check them out. They've also got a podcast. So they're doing lots of interviews with folks on their podcast, thinking about this area. How do we get more BIPOC folks in healthcare? Black Medical Students Association at U of T, I think they were kind of on the forefront about thinking of this. So you can check them out. That is their Twitter there. So it's the largest union of Black medical students in Canada. And I wanted to show you in the next slide a little bit of history with this last one. So in 2016, there was only one Black medical student entered U of T. And they started to mobilize, started to collectivize, to get together and talk about what that needs to look like, students in different spaces. How can we raise the number of students, Black med school students? And so in 2020, you can see in the picture here, 60 plus Black med students representing all 17 med schools in Canada came together for our first national meeting. This is truly our ancestors' wildest dreams. So between 2016 and 2020, that's not that long. And that organizing did this, right? That folks together, working together, did this. 60 plus Black med students across all med schools in Canada get together for their first national meeting. So we can see this tangible change happening, right? When we move the discussions in new ways, when we start to organize, when we get together, we can make change, right? This is going to change, patient experience in the future. This. So Black Creek Community Health Center, we talked about them, I think last week. I highlighted some of their work. So they're here in the area of York University kind of area. Black Creek give us 4 tangible things that we can do in terms of intervening in racism. So you can read them there. Identify racial inequities and disparity in our workplaces and in the sectors we work, whether it's healthcare, criminal justice, education, or employment. Champion anti-racist ideas and policies with specific actions. Challenge accountability structures to address brutality, violence, and harms to Black communities, specifically in the Jane Finch, Humber River Black Creek area. Advocate for the allocation of protected funds to provide culturally appropriate health and well-being support within our community. That's something that you mentioned in your critical reflection papers, right? And that's really an example of targeted universalism. So looking for protected funds within our universal system that will do support for specific groups in a very specific ways. I wanted to highlight this. This is happening on Wednesday of this week, Wednesday, November 4th, and it's open for folks who are healthcare providers, but also students. So anyone, you're interested in health and equity, thinking about health and poverty, and you're, in health studies right now, you can join them. It's a Zoom meeting. I put the link up there, and this is hyperlinked, so you can, or maybe this is, anyways, you can just check it out and join them at their meeting and see what organizing is happening in this area right now in Toronto. So I wanted to think, this is kind of gearing up towards the next piece of the lecture, which is going to be the guest lecture. So I want us to think about this idea, and this is a huge kind of topic right now. Most of you, if not all of you, if you're here in Canada, have heard at least the conversations around defunding the police. And what I would really want us to think about right now is this idea of defunding the police as a public health measure, right? So we know disproportionately Black and racialized and disabled folks are the ones who live the most police violence and brutality and trauma. So if we think about that, basically as defunding the police equaling better health outcomes. So actually, the ways that we frame conversations around health need to include defunding the police. So if you're really new to this idea, if you're like really resistant to it and thinking like, what is going on? What are you talking about? Please go to this video. It's one of these, with the little whiteboard drawings. It's a really great primer on what do we mean when we say defund the police. And then I will invite you to go further. So I mentioned at the beginning, doctors for defunding the police started to mobilize their BIPOC doctors committed to the health of their communities, thinking about policing as a public health crisis. They mobilized, I think, right at the beginning of COVID. And they are super rad, pushing the conversation in really interesting ways. I would urge you to go to their Twitter, if you're on Twitter, your Instagram, and follow them. Follow them for this week. What are they talking about? Where are they pushing the conversation? How are they reacting to things? How are they framing health and access to health in very different ways? So they did in town hall in the summer, Doctors for Defunding the Police, and there they are. That's who spoke. They're some of the organizers of the collective. So you can go and check it out. It's like just over an hour. So, take in bits and pieces of it as much as you can. Really interesting conversation around how they mobilized, what they're mobilizing for, why policing is a public health crisis. These are doctors themselves on the front lines telling us that we need to take the defund police movement seriously, make these changes in society in order to improve health outcomes for marginalized communities. So I also linked right here this article by Samir Boulay, who is one of the doctors, the founding doctors. And we read an excerpt from him at the beginning. And it's a really great article, just really an overview kind of interview talking about why this collective formed, the need for it, and what they're asking for. Let me move this down. So Mariame Kaba does a lot of really, really interesting mobilizing in the United States around abolition. So it's kind of moving further than defunding the police. And really what she's telling us is that it's just us asking different questions on how we can keep each other safe. So I talked about it a little bit in one of our earlier lectures, where I talked about this idea of ways that we care for each other and how that looks different based on intersections of race, disability, class. And so I think really what abolition, defunding the police movements are asking us to do is asking us really to ask different questions, asking us to who is being centered, who is being harmed, who is being protected. And so you can read this quote card here, and then I put up some more links. So there's really, kind of that graphic novel style that someone did about Kaba's ideas. So really walking you through like all the questions that pop into your mind, like, we're not defunding the police. What are you saying? Who's going to keep us safe? What are we going to do with, the horrific people who commit horrific crimes? If you are asking these questions, go to this, go here, and it's an easy way to go through the graphic novel. She just published this article, I think 4 days ago. So you are thinking about becoming an abolitionist. It's essential reading. I just urge you to go there and start to read. I think it's maybe a 6-minute read. And it's just really, in very plain, clear language, talks about at this moment in these social pandemics of COVID, racism, ableism, classism, what we need to do differently, and centering very different questions. So I hope this is, some of you are already thinking about this, some of you are really far into this thinking, some of you are new, but I really urge you to think about how it intersects with health. Okay, so I want to introduce our guest speaker. I'm going to post her lecture on a separate link. So I'm going to do the introduction now, and then you can go to the separate link. So as I mentioned at the beginning, our guest speaker for today is Andrea Vasquez Jimenez. She just ran, as I said, for the NDP in this area that York sits within. She actually did this guest lecture, I think like the day before the election, because we just had a by-election here. Super smart, brilliant, engaged organizer, working in the field. I put her Twitter, TikTok, and IG handles there. She's also, oh, sorry, that one didn't come up. She's also the co-director of LAEN Toronto, which works in kind of the space of education and Latinx communities. And a lot of her work is centered around police-free schools. There's been a lot of movement to get cops out of elementary schools and high schools, and universities too. Hamilton actually just voted, the Hamilton School Board just voted to remove cops from schools. So the idea is to have different resources for responding to students in distress, that we do not need to be handcuffing 6-year-old Black children in schools to keep who safe in that circumstance. So Andrea is going to make the links for us between police-free schools and health. So as I said, I'll post that. The link for that lecture is going to be under this one. So I urge you to go. She is a brilliant organizer. I've thrown up some resources that she sent after you watch her lecture. If you're interested in getting involved, I hyperlinked the petition here to get cops out of schools province-wide, including universities. There's also a Google Doc that they've put together, kind of ways you can get engaged. So depending on how much time and space you have in your life right now. And then I put their Instagram and Twitter here. So this is, that's their hashtag, and you can go and see all of their organizing, follow them on their social channels. Okay, so before we go, I wanted to just talk about next week. So this week we took up racial justice. Next week we will talk about disability justice. So we're going to have, it'll be our first one. I think we're going to do one, maybe two of these, a live guest lecture with Elizabeth Moeller, experiencing healthcare through a disability lens. I threw up a picture of her with, she's been on the CBC a bunch of times. So I threw up one of the pieces she did on CBC there. So basically the way it will work, it's next week, so Tuesday, November 10th, and I'll put the Zoom link into that week, so in week 8's folder, and basically we'll just have a regular live lecture at 2:30 p.m. So a regular class time. Whoever is available will come on Zoom. Elizabeth and I will be there. Elizabeth will do her lecture, and then you'll have an opportunity to engage. So ask questions, whether it's in the chat or on camera. Of course, it will be recorded and posted. So if you can't make it, don't worry, we will record it. But if you are interested in asking a question, looking through the readings, you can look up a little bit about Elizabeth. She's quite, again, another sort of community organizer. She's really engaged in this area. So if you have questions about it, especially if you're thinking about writing your paper in this area, or it's, a piece of your lived experience, or it's something you want to engage more in your own work. So thinking about ways that ableism shows up in healthcare and in health. So we'll do that next week. So I'll post that Zoom link, and it will be 2:30 next week, and I'll send a couple reminders. And then also next week, they just fell together on the same day, but we will have a tutorial altogether that will also be live, because we're going to have the librarian Thumeka come in and give us a live tutorial together. So we'll have the lecture, and then at 4:30 you can come back on Zoom. Sorry, I'll put in the week 8 folder. I'll put the Zoom link in the week 8 folder, and it will be a live tutorial. And I sent her kind of the information of what you're doing for your assignment. And so it's going to be some guidance from her just around library resources, especially if you're in first year. But again, all years, we can all kind of get a refresh on how we navigate the library, use the library. There's so many things, even at the graduate level, that students don't know about, in terms of ways that we have dedicated subject librarians, all the kind of ways that you can get assistance in terms of research and reading. And also I asked her to focus a little bit on using the library during COVID times. So she's going to touch on that and highlight, what it kind of looks like right now. So next week, again, we'll just be live. So we'll all be coming on, but both will be recorded. So Elizabeth's lecture will be recorded, and then the tutorial will be recorded for those of you who can't make it at 4:30. So wish you the good rest of the week, and I will see you next week for disability justice. And just a reminder to go to the next file down, which will be Andrea's guest lecture. Have a wonderful week. Thanks.